So this week we're going to be talking about good clinical practice, or GCP. So we're going to get oriented and get introduced to that and learn kind of what that's all about. So in order to do that, we have a couple of readings this week. First of all, we have an overview of FDA regulations that's done by Dr. Hirschfield. You'll find that out on Moodle. It's a PowerPoint presentation, and it's going to discuss FDA regulations that pertain to drugs that we're going over in this course. So in our first week, we talked about the foundational documents, the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, and the Belmont Report, which are the primary ethical documents that sort of regulate the thinking with regard to ethics in our industry. And so you've read through those, you've kind of gotten familiar with them. You've also gotten familiar with the history of regulations as they pertain to pharmaceuticals, and seen some of the legislative events that have occurred over the years that have really been responses to some of the actions that have occurred by either companies or people in our industry, and how that changes over the course of time and changes the regulatory requirements with respect to producing and selling drugs. So we want to go over the overview from Dr. Hirschfield. Then you'll also have some readings that are in 21 CFR, which is part of the FDA Federal Code that regulates drugs. So if you'll look through the documents that are out there on Moodle, you'll see where there are a couple of sections that are contained in 21 CFR. The primary one that we're going to focus on this week is going to be 21 CFR 312, which is going to be investigational new drug application, or IND, and specifically Subpart D, which is the responsibilities of sponsors and investigators. It's about 9 pages long. I'd like you to read through that and be familiar with it, because it does discuss many of the things that we have to be familiar with and we have to have knowledge of as we're working in our industry. A couple of the other sections in that area in 21 CFR include 21 CFR Part 11, which pertains to electronic records or electronic signatures. We also have 21 CFR Part 50, which is the protection of human subjects, and we're going to get into that section a little bit later in our course. Also 21 CFR Part 54, which are the requirements for financial disclosure, which we'll have a section on that as we move along. And then also 21 CFR 56, which are the requirements for institutional review boards. And we do have some content on that later on in our course. The final item down there is 21 CFR 314, which are the requirements for the new drug application, which is the application where a sponsor presents that to the FDA so that they can get market approval to sell their drug. We won't talk about that a whole lot in this course, but we will kind of touch on a little bit of some of the elements in that. Also, I'd like for you to, in addition to reading through 21 CFR 312 on the IND application, also I'd like for you to become familiar with ICH, E6, specifically sections 2 through 5, which are in your textbook, and more importantly, try and concentrate on sections 4 and 5, which are on pages 83 to 93. So ICH stands for International Conference on Harmonization, which is, as you can imagine, is an international consortium made up of United States, Europe, and Japan. And what that comprises of is all of the requirements for good clinical practice that govern how we would conduct a clinical trial. So as you go through those, you'll see some similarities with that. You'll also see a few things that are a little bit different about the specific requirements. So do take note of that. And then we'll go over some of those in the project that we'll work on this week. Our learning objectives this week will be to discuss the GCP requirements that are associated with the Food and Drug Administration regulations, 21 CFR and their subparts, and also the ICH guidelines, specifically ICH E6. You'll find links to those on your Moodle page. We're also going to talk about citing the differences and the similarities between the FDA and the ICH GCP requirements. We're also going to discuss this week's project in a little more detail as we go along. But it's important to understand that any clinical trial that's conducted under the jurisdiction of the Food and Drug Administration, under what's called an investigational new drug application. The FDA has jurisdiction over that trial and has jurisdiction over the clinical sites that conduct that trial. And it does not matter if those sites are in the United States or not. You may have sites that are in Europe or in Asia or in South America or anywhere around the world that participate in one of those trials. And when they do, they still fall under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. That means that the FDA can hold investigators accountable for following the rules, following the guidelines, which in this case, they are the law. And they can also hold sponsors responsible for the same thing. They'll typically go out and audit sites that are in other countries around the world. They don't do that very often, but they will every once in a while. So it's important to understand the distinction between the two. And then, as I said, we're going to talk a little bit more as we go along about the differences and similarities between the FDA and the ICH good clinical practice requirements. So as I mentioned, FDA regulations, they are the law for trials that are conducted in the United States and for trials that are conducted under the jurisdiction of an IND, even though they may be in countries around the world. So it's important to understand the difference between a law and a guideline. A law is something that you have to follow. Otherwise, there's some pretty stiff consequences in many cases. A guideline is something that you're expected to follow, but maybe not, you may not follow it all the time. So it's important to understand the differences between the two. Now, for most companies, most sponsors, most pharma companies, most medical device companies, contract research organizations, vendors that work in our industry are going to follow the ICH GCP guidelines, specifically in the case of pharma companies, E6, although there are other components to that guideline that we don't necessarily touch on in our course. E6 is the principal section of that guideline that governs what we're doing as far as clinical trials goes. So they will follow those guidelines, and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration does acknowledge that ICH GCP E6 is their current thinking on good clinical practice. So even though they may differ slightly from the FDA regulations, FDA does pretty much consider E6 to be its most current thinking. And ICH GCP 6 has been accepted by most countries around the world as their good clinical practice standard. So that's good because that means it's going to be consistent whether a trial is being conducted in Asia, in South America, Europe, North America, wherever it may be. So this week we're going to have a short project to work on that's going to be a comparison between the good clinical practice standards of FDA and ICH. And so the first thing you're going to do is you're going to read the Paul Below article that discusses those similarities and differences. That article is posted in the week 2 folder on Moodle. So you'll be able to pull that up and print it off if you want, or if you just want to read it online, however you want to do it, whichever is easier for you. And then once you've done that, I posted on there a series of 6 topics that are related to that article. So what you're going to do is choose 4 of the 6, and you're going to compile a comparison and use that comparison to discuss the similarities and differences. I put some instructions out there on Moodle, which I think are going to be pretty easy to follow. You'll compile that in Microsoft Word, and you can just use the table format that I've put out there in my instructions. So more than likely your assignment's probably going to be about maybe 2 pages. And then I've put a link out there where you can submit that. When you do, make sure that the file name in your document has your last name in it, so it doesn't get mixed up with somebody else's. So you'll see that out there. If you have any questions about it, let me know, but I think it will be pretty apparent what to do, and I don't think anybody will have any difficulty with that. So I'd like for you to work on that this week. It will be due by next Monday. So once you start getting into this, it'll be due, within a week. Go ahead and get it out there. Don't wait until the last day. But I don't think it'll take you very long. It should not take you longer than maybe a couple of hours to work on it, if even that long. So like I said, if you have questions, put them on the Moodle page where it asks for questions for the instructor. That way everybody can see them and the other students can see the answers as well. So good luck to you. I think you'll have good time with it. I don't think anybody will have any difficulty, but if you do, certainly let me know and we'll take it from there.